Rhetoric of Ibsen, and today I'll introduce you to the field of linguistics that studies meaning in interaction. The field of pragmatics is large and can be covered in 45 minutes, but in this lecture we'll go through its most central parts. We'll start out by looking at pragmatics from the point of view of its subject of study. Then we'll also consider deixis and deictic expressions that are used in language to refer or point at something. Presuppositions are those types of meanings that are not directly expressed through language, but they can be derived from specific words and syntactic structures. We'll also take a look at the cooperative principle of conversation and occasions when people fail to observe it. And finally, we'll take a cursory look at speech acts in pragmatics and consider their traditional classification. So let's start with the subject of study in pragmatics. Consider this simple sentence. In terms of syntax, it's a well-formulated English sentence because its constituent parts, subject, verb, direct object, and adverbial, are arranged in grammatically correct word order in English, characteristic of interrogative sentences. In terms of semantics, this sentence can be analyzed in the following way. Will is a function word or a grammeme, and a branch of semantics called grammatical semantics that studies grammemes categorizes will as an auxiliary verb. It can express a number of meanings in English. A lethic modality, also known as dynamic modality, and convey verbal meanings that are based on the physical laws of nature. In oil will float on water, will float can be paraphrased as it's physically possible for oil to float on water. Will can also express epistemic modality, in cases usually analyzed in terms of future reference. Some grammar books also mention that will can express volition, in such cases as I will help you clean it up. I believe, though, that the utterances that imply the speaker's intention to do something in the future are essentially epistemic, because intention refers to the hypothetical world and must belong within the confines of epistemic modality. One of will's less frequent uses is that of deontic obligation, that is usually termed as order. Will you put it down? Said with the falling intonation, or you will put it down, with the stress falling on will. And finally, will can express another deontic meaning, that of cancellation of obligation. It's found in situations when somebody forces you to do something, speaking pragmatically, performs an act of obligation, and you cancel it through negation. You is a second person singular or plural pronoun. It's an anaphor. That is a type of grammeme that had the grammatical function of pointing or referring to something, called a referent. And the same goes for the third person singular pronoun it. In contrast to will, the verb put has its own semantic meaning, which makes it a lexical word or a lexeme. But this verb has also a number of grammatical features. In terms of its valency pattern, it's a complex transitive verb that requires 3 obligatory clause elements. But since put is a lexeme, it's studied by the branch of semantics called lexical semantics or lexicography, and its meaning can be found in a dictionary. Down can function as an adverb, a preposition, an adjective, a verb, and in our case, an adverb. And the description of its lexical meaning can be found in a dictionary. To sum up, semantics studies how words literally connect to things out there. We therefore speak of more or less fixed semantic meanings. But neither grammatical nor lexical semantics can tell us about the reference of you and it. And it's here where pragmatics comes in. Will you put it down can be uttered in different situations. It can be said by a policeman to a bank burglar who denies to obey the officer's order and put his gun down in the first place. It can also be uttered in a classroom situation by a very angry teacher who vainly attempts to ensure compliance from one of her less willing to cooperate pupils, or by a mother to her child who has allergy to nuts and could die if he eats only one nut, but he is not willing to obey his mother. But actually, this utterance was produced by one of the respondents participating in my pilot test on speech acts. We'll look at the details of this situation under the item Context and Participants. So when we look at this utterance from a pragmatic point of view, we need to consider both the speaker with his or her implied meaning called implicature, and the hearer, whose job in a conversation is to decode the speaker's implicature, which is called inference. The processes of the speakers encoding the message into language and the hearers decoding it is largely predetermined by their shared knowledge of social rules and conventions that guide and determine the appropriate type of behavior in general and linguistic behavior in particular. And context includes the situation itself and its participants. And now let's take a look at deixis. There are words that are among the first words spoken by very young children. They use them to indicate people through person deixis, location via spatial deixis, and time via temporal deixis. These words can't be interpreted without considering the speaker, the hearer, and the context. Dialectics or deixis is the means of pointing via language, and any linguistic form that is used to accomplish this pointing function is called a dialectic expression. Deixis is clearly a form of referring that is tied to the speaker's location, technically called the dialectic center. And the most basic distinction between dialectic expressions is near speaker versus away from speaker. So proximal terms such as this, here, and now are typically interpreted as indicators of somebody or something being close to the speaker. And distal terms such as that, there, and then express distance to the speaker. And there are languages like Japanese that even distinguish between distal terms and have differing grammatical forms, for there is near, hearer, and there is away from, both speaker and hearer. Person deixis clearly operates on a basic three-part division. The speaker and the pronouns for first person I, the hearer and the second person pronouns you, and the third person he, she, or it. In many languages, these dialectic categories of speaker, hearer, and others are elaborated with markers of relative social status, which can be high, equal, or low. And the discussion of the circumstances that lead to the choice of one of these forms rather than another is sometimes described as social deixis. For example, the forms of address Mr. John, Professor, Madam, or Sir communicate something about the speaker's view of his or her relationship with the hearer. And expressions that indicate higher status are described as honorifics. So we usually use them when referring to a hearer with higher social status and more social power than ourselves, to older people, and to a non-familiar addressee. And there are other forms of address that indicate equal or lower social status of the hearer. We tend to use them to a lower, younger, less powerful, or simply familiar addressee. In didactic terms, the basic I and you interaction doesn't include third person. It's not a direct participant, an outsider, making third person pronouns distal forms in terms of person deixis. That means that if the speaker wants to communicate distance and non-familiarity to the hearer, she would use a third person form. In English, this can be done for an ironic or humorous effect. For example, in "Would His Highness clean up after himself?" the speaker implies that the hearer is being very lazy by referring to him in third person terms. The distance associated with third person forms is also used to make potential accusations less direct, as for example, somebody didn't clean up after himself, the implicature of which is that you didn't clean up. Finally, the use of the third person pronouns can make a potentially personal issue seem like an impersonal one, based on a general rule, as in, each person has to clean up after him or herself. And the last thing I'd like to mention with regard to person deixis is two uses of the first person plural we. So if the speaker uses the pronoun we and doesn't include the hearer, then we call it an exclusive we. We find it, for example, in German weather reports. When German meteorologists use we, they imply themselves, as for example in "Tomorrow the wind will come from the south," which we have marked on the map. Danish meteorologists, on the other hand, use we about themselves and all other Danes that are watching the program, as in "I morgen får vi godt vejr." So the form of we that includes the hearer is called an inclusive we. Spatial deixis, just like person deixis, is based on the concept of distance. In present-day English, the basic distinction between things and people located near speaker and away from speaker is realized through only two adverbs, here and there, that are also called position adverbs. In Danish, they correspond to her, henne, and der henne. However, in older texts and English dialects, such didactic expressions as hither, well, meaning to this place, and thence, meaning to that place, can be found. Well, these English direction adverbs, well, called so because they include the meaning of motion towards and away from the speaker, now sound archaic. whereas its Danish equivalents herhin and derhin are still used today. The concept of motion toward speaker that is becoming visible is mentioned in literature as being the first didactic meaning learned by children, well, simply because they use words like this and here before they acquire there and that, which are associated with things that move out of the child's visual space. Besides, it's important to remember that location from the speaker's perspective can be fixed mentally as well as physically. For example, if here in I'm not here now mean the place of the speaker's utterance and now means the time of the speaker's utterance, then this utterance should be nonsense. However, I can say I'm not here now as a message on the answering machine of my phone and project that the now will apply to any time someone tries to call me. This kind of dramatic performance for a future audience is called didactic projection. Usually, physically close objects are treated by us as psychologically close, and something physically distant will generally be treated by us as psychologically distant. However, we can treat physically close to us objects as psychologically distant by using distal forms, as in I don't like that. Well, this is known as psychological distance. Temporal Deixis. The proximal form now indicates both the time when the speaker utters something and the time when the hearer hears it. The distal then, on the other hand, applies to both past and future time relative to the speaker's present time. This can be illustrated on the following examples. October 22nd, 1962, I was in Scotland then, with then referring to the past. And dinner at 8:30 on Sunday, okay, I'll see then. With then refers to a future event. One basic type of temporal deixis in English is the choice of verb tense. And English has only two basic forms: the present and the past. The present tense in the proximal form, and the past tense is the distal form. Well, that means that we usually treat something having taken place in the past as distant from our current time. This use of temporal deixis is called temporal or factual distance. However, if we want to treat things as extremely unlikely or impossible, we'd also mark them via the distal past tense forms. As in, I could be in Hawaii if I had a lot of money. So we don't treat this idea as something that has happened to me in the past. Well, this idea is presented didactically so distant that we infer the negative, that I've never been to Hawaii and that I'm not rich. Well, this use of temporal deixis is called psychological or counter-factual distance. The same mechanism is found in polite indirect requests, as for example in "Would you mind reaching the salt?", where the distal past tense form would signals psychological distance to the hearer, which in Anglo-Saxon language communities is generally associated with politeness. And my last point concerned the possible reason behind the notorious present third-person singular verbal S ending. Well, notorious because it's the most frequent stumbling block for most English learners. As we've already noted, third person is always distal in the basic I-you interaction. And while first and second person pronouns I and you are proximal per se, the third person, which is inherently distal, requires an additional grammatical marker that will place it in the present situation and signal proximity. This is clearly seen in the phonetic audible correspondence, a similarity between the proximal present tense form stays and the proximal pronoun this, as well as the distal past time stayed and the distal pronoun that. Well, I believe it's the case of what is known in linguistics as iconicity. But to tell the truth, I've never met the discussion of the English third person singular s and see it as a possible topic for a bachelor thesis in grammar. And now let's move on to presupposition. In many discussions, the concept of presupposition is treated as a relationship between two propositions. Let's take a look at the following sentence. If we say that sentence 1 contains the proposition P and sentence 2 contains the proposition Q, then using the symbol to mean presupposes, we can represent the relationship between the two propositions as in 3, where P presupposes Q. The basic property of presupposition is its constancy under negation. Let's consider a situation where somebody made a statement as in 1. Everybody knows that Kim is a celebrity. But you disagree with statement 1, saying that everybody doesn't know that Kim is a celebrity. But even though we disagree about the validity of P, we both assume the truth of Q, that Kim is a celebrity. So we can conclude that the proposition Q, as shown in 4, is presupposed by both P and not P. And most importantly, it remains constant under negation. And now let's consider types of presupposition. Well, first and foremost, we already noted that presupposition should be understood in terms of speakers' assumptions. And those assumptions can be conveyed via language in the form of different words, phrases, and structures. So such words and phrases can be knows, realizes, regrets, that are also known as mental verbs. The presupposed information following a verb, like knows, can be treated as a fact. This type of presupposition is called factive presupposition. So, such mental verbs as realize, know, regret, etc. have factive presuppositions. There are also a number of forms like manage and stop that contain two meanings. One of them is their what's called asserted meaning, that is conveyed overtly, and another one is non-asserted or presupposed and is conveyed covertly. For example, in the statement, they managed to pass the exam, the asserted meaning is that they succeeded in passing the exam. By the presupposed or non-asserted meaning, however, is that they tried to pass the exam. The asserted meaning in he stopped smoking is that he succeeded in quitting smoking. And stop would conventionally be interpreted as presupposing used to. And again, presupposes before. So these forms are treated as a source of lexical presupposition. The possessive constructions in particular, as Mary's dog, and all definite noun phrases in general, are associated with the presupposition of existence. For example, by saying Mary's dog is cute, the Queen of Denmark, and the girl next door, I commit myself to the existence of the named entities, the dog, the queen, and the girl. These forms trigger existential presupposition. The next type of presupposition operates not on a word level, but is based on more syntactically complex structures, such as sentences and clauses. For example, the WH question construction, also known as a special question, is conventionally interpreted with the presupposition that the information after the interrogative adverb when is already known to be the case. The same goes for cleft sentences, as in it's girls that I'm watching, where the information in that clause is presupposed to be true. And the so-called pseudo-clefts, as in what Andrew admired most was painting miniature soldiers. It also triggered the presupposition that Andrew painted miniature soldiers. All of these forms are treated at the source of structural presupposition. Finally, there are a number of verbs in English whose presupposed, that is, non-asserted meaning is assumed not to be true. So verbs like to dream and to pretend, as shown in the examples, are used with the presupposition that what follows is not true. These presuppositions are called non-factive presuppositions. And if you look at the last sentence, if I had a yacht, the conditional structure known as the if clause doesn't merely imply something non-factual. This type of structure creates a counter-factual presupposition, because what it presupposes is not only not true, but is the opposite of what is true. And now, let's consider the notions of context and participants. At the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that "will you put it down" was said by one of the British English respondents who participated in my study on speech acts. But as you can see, he, it was a man, actually said a bit more than just "will you put it down." The test procedure was that the instructor read out loud a short scenario description called the mobile scenario, and the respondent's task was to listen carefully and try to imagine the situation as if he was in it himself. He didn't have to think too much about the answer, but to come up with an immediate reaction instead. As an extra help, he was given this picture. It went like this. Imagine yourself in the quiet compartment on a train in England. Suddenly, a mobile phone rings, and a young woman starts speaking loudly. When she stops, one of the passengers points to the quiet sign, while you say to her, "No mobiles here." She turns away from you without responding, looking at you as if you're an idiot. 5 minutes later, her mobile rings again, and again she speaks loudly, ignoring everyone. You have had enough now, so you say. To which the respondent reacted with what's called in Pragmatics a speech act. "Will you put it down now, young lady? If you don't, I'll call the conductor." When we analyze speech acts, one of the things that we need to take into consideration is social context. And one of the most influential classifications of social contexts was proposed by a Dutch linguist, Teun van Dijk, who attempted to merge cognitive theory and pragmatics. According to his theory, any social context is a hierarchically structured system comprising a lot of different parameters. At the primary level, any given social context can be analyzed as being private or public. So the mobile situation here can be said to be public. At the secondary level, both private and public contexts can further be subdivided into institutional or formal and informal. And our situation is clearly public informal, because it takes place in public transport, and yet it lacks a set of properties and relations conventionally associated with formal contexts, such as courts and schools. A possible example of a private informal context is a family dinner at home. And the example of a private formal situation could be a wedding dinner. I hope you've got the general idea of the notion of social context. The last thing is that our behavior in general, and linguistic behavior in particular, is largely determined by conventions, rules, laws, principles, norms, and values. That also means that participants in a communication situation, speaker and hearer, behave according to a set of properties and relations that define a set of possible social actions. For example, in the private institution of a family, mother and father are usually associated with a parent role. Interlocutors can also have different properties, such as sex, gender, or age. And our social relations can be governed by the factor of dominance, as well as we can perform different functions. All these extra-linguistic parameters are also known as social variables. And now let's consider the relation of dominance as an example. In most language communities, if the speaker has more social power than the hearer, then she would speak down, as it were, to the hearer, which is most often realized directly through an imperative construction, as in, take a seat, please. And vice versa. If the speaker has less social power than the hearer, she would speak up to the hearer and approach the hearer indirectly through the interrogative construction, as in, won't you sit down? And finally, if speaker and hearer are equal in terms of their social power, then the choice of the requesting strategy will depend on the level of familiarity. For example, in interaction between friends that know each other well, communication is likely to be more direct than that with strangers. But the main idea here is that these different forms of linguistic behavior are conventionalized. But that doesn't mean that they are universal, because what's considered to be polite or impolite, let's say in Britain or the US, isn't necessarily the case in Russia or Poland, which means that they differ from one language community to another. Going back to our mobile scenario, we can now analyze it in terms of its social context, participants, and their relative power, which in turn determines social distance between them. All these parameters are believed to affect the speaker's choice of a speech act in this specific situation. But before we take a closer look at speech acts, let's consider the cooperative principle in pragmatics. Consider the following scenario. There is a woman with a large dog sitting on the ground beside her. A man comes along and asks, "Does your dog bite?" "No, he doesn't," she answers. "He never bites." "Can I touch your dog?" he asks. "Yes, you can," the woman answers. "He likes people." The man reaches down to pat the dog, and the dog bites him. "Ouch! You said your dog never bites." "That's right. He doesn't," said the woman. "But that's not my dog." So what goes wrong in this scenario? It seems that from the man's perspective, the woman's answer provides less information than expected. and perhaps the information she provides is simply false. Of course, the story wouldn't be so funny had she provided the required amount of truthful information. But there is a general assumption that people involved in a conversation will cooperate with others. This assumption is so pervasive that it can be stated as a cooperative principle of conversation. This principle, which you can read on the screen, and its 4 sub-principles at which we'll look in a minute, arose from the tradition of ordinary language philosophy. It was first outlined by Paul Grice in his lecture at Harvard University in 1967. Later, in papers published in 1975, 78, and 81, Grice expanded upon his earlier work. But he never fully developed his theory. That means that there are many gaps and inconsistencies in his writings, not mentioning the fact that even though Grice's principle may work well in English, the pragmatic research showed that its maxims are of no use in such languages as Russian and Chinese. But nevertheless, the cooperative principle has proved to be one of the most influential theories in the development of pragmatics. Let's take a look at Grice's 4 maxims. We assume that people are normally going to provide an appropriate amount of information, that they are telling the truth, being relevant, and trying to be as clear as they can. These principles are never mentioned in normal interaction and should be understood as our unstated assumptions. However, if we fail to observe these unsaid principles, the communication may break down. In this story, we find that all the 3 maxims, that of quantity, quality, and manner, have been suspended. But why? Well, let's consider 5 basic occasions when people fail to observe the maxims. The most important category that generates an implicature, that is, a hidden non-asserted meaning, is when a speaker blatantly fails to observe a maxim, because he or she wishes to prompt the hearer to look for a meaning that is different from the expressed meaning. In pragmatic terms, it's called the speaker generates an implicature. So when we flout a maxim, we do so without any intention of deceiving or misleading the hearer. For example, if I say I could eat a horse, we can argue that I'm flouting the maxim of quality, but not because I'm lying, but because I'm exaggerating. This is known as hyperbole. Other examples of flouting the maxim of quality include irony or sarcasm and metaphor. And very often, we fail to observe several maxims at a time. The next type of non-observance is violation. Violating a maxim may be the exact opposite of flouting a maxim, which is usually found in cases when we say something that is true in order to imply a lie, or simply speaking, when we wish to mislead the hearer on purpose. The third category of non-observance is infringing a maxim. If a speaker has no intention of generating an implicature or deceiving the hearer, he or she is said to infringe the maxim. We usually find this type of non-observance with children and a foreign learner, whose command of the language is imperfect. We also find it with speakers whose performance is impaired in some way, due to nervousness, drunkenness, or excitement. And with speakers that are constitutionally incapable of speaking clearly, to the point. Opting out occurs frequently in public life, when we can't, for legal or ethical reasons, reply in the way normally expected. For example, an investigating journalist may refuse to relay information given in confidence, as in, well, honestly, I can't tell you a thing, because what was said to me was told me in confidence. And finally, situations where we don't expect that speakers will provide precise or sufficient information are described as suspensions of the maxim. They may be culture-specific or specific to particular events. An example of the culture-specific suspension could be that the acting community in Britain, but not the population at large, refrain from uttering the name of Shakespeare's play Macbeth, referring instead to the Scottish play, because to say Macbeth out loud is supposed to bring bad luck. And event-specific suspensions we usually find in funeral orations, obituaries, poetry, telegrams, and jokes, just like in the dog scenario. And finally, sometimes communication may break down not due to the 5 categories of non-observance we've discovered, but simply to interlocutors' misconstrual of a given social context in terms of it being private, public, formal, or informal, and participants in a communication situation in terms of their social variables. And now, let's turn to the last item of the lecture, speech acts. We've already established that will you put it down is a speech act. But what is a speech act? This notion was introduced by the founding father of pragmatics, John Austin. He was a British philosopher of language, who in the mid-50s delivered a series of lectures at Harvard that first after his death were published by his students in the form of a book, How to Do Things with Words. Austin found that there are language units called utterances, or in more technical term, sentential acts, that can be true or false. For example, we can say that the statements humans are animals and they have populated the earth for thousands of years can be true or false. But people don't only produce utterances containing grammatical structures and words. They perform actions via those utterances. And if statements can be true or false, speech acts can't. Well, later, one of John Austin's followers, John Searle, took Austin's terms locution, illocution, and perlocution and offered a definition of a speech act. So any speech act consists of a proposition which should be understood as a fixed semantic meaning that can be true or false. And the proposition, or will you put it down, can be expressed as you will put it down. In pragmatic terms, this level of a speech act is called locution. At the level beneath locution, which is visible, so to speak, we find implicature, which, as we've already noted, is a non-asserted meaning, or the speaker's intention. The implicature of will you put it down can be paraphrased as I need or demand that you put it down. In pragmatic terms, this level of a speech act is called illocution. And together, the overt locution and covert illocution make up a complete utterance. Will you put it down? And this multi-layered language structure is called a speech act. We've already found that a speech act can't be true or false. But they're what's called perlocutionary effects, can be true or false, because we can say that it is true that the hearer has put it down, or that it's not true that the hearer has put it down. Besides defining what a speech act is, John Searle also developed his theory of speech acts, where he classified them in terms of their illocution. So, declarations are those kinds of speech acts that change the world via their utterance. In other words, a mere uttering of those words changes the world. As the example illustrates, the speaker has to have a special institutional role in a specific context in order to perform a declaration appropriately. Representatives, that are also called statements or constitutives, state what the speaker believes to be the case or not, as in humans are animals. Expressives don't change the world, but simply state what the speaker feels. They express psychological states and can be statements of pleasure, pain, likes, dislikes, joy, or sorrow, as in, I'm really sorry. Directives are those kinds of speech acts that speakers use to get someone else to do something. In other words, they are the speaker's attempts to make the world fit words. So the speaker can perform different functions with the help of a directive speech act. She can request, offer, suggest, order, or forbid something, as in, don't open the window. Finally, commissives express what the speaker intends. They are promises, threats, refusals, or pledges. Besides, speech acts can be distinguished on the basis of structure or form. Whenever there is a direct relationship between a form and a function, we have a direct speech act. And whenever there is an indirect relationship between a form and a function, we have an indirect speech act. There are three basic structural forms in English: the declarative form, the imperative form, and the interrogative form. We can perform different acts or functions with the help of these three forms. We can make statements, promises, threats, requests, ask questions, give offers and orders, and make suggestions. For example, when I say she's amazing tonight, I state what I believe to be true through a declarative sentence form. Since there is a direct relationship between a declarative and a statement, because we normally state that something is true or untrue via the declarative sentence structure, my utterance can be analyzed as a direct speech act. And when I say, "Isn't she amazing tonight?" and use a falling intonation, I also make a statement. That in contrast to the previous example, now I'm stating my belief indirectly by using the word order of a general question. This makes it, of course, an indirect speech act, because we usually ask questions rather than make statements with the help of interrogatives. And now, let's wrap it up and analyze will you put it down in terms of its form or locution, which is of course interrogative, and its function or illocution, which in this case is an order. We usually give orders through imperative sentence forms, which leads us to the conclusion that will you put it down is an indirect directive, speech act, expressing order. You can find a comprehensive overview of pragmatics in George Yoole's Pragmatics. A more elaborate description of the topics of today's lecture can also be found in Thomas's excellent textbook on pragmatics. And a detailed account of traditional and more recent approaches to directive speech acts can be found in my doctoral dissertation. The slides of this lecture can also be accessed from this link. Thank you for watching this video.